Miles Evans, and Arjun. I'm not going to say it. I messed it up earlier today, so I apologize, Arjun. But we first up have Jamie. Are you on, Jamie?
Yes, I'm here.
Nope. I guess I apologize. I was going off list. Arjun, you're first. I'm sorry. Do you want to use that or this? There's a computer there and it's got everything. Okay. Yep. So you're there and then just use the clicker. Oh, we'll take it. Don't worry about it. Oh, they'll ask questions at you.
All right. Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Arjun Brahmadevanahali. I'm an associate at the law firm of Morgan Lewis and Bacchius in Washington, D.C. So apologies in advance. You got to hear the lawyer first, but I think that's by design. So you'll hear the folks who are doing some great storage and VPP work on the ground right after me. But I'd like to just start out by talking a little bit about energy storage developments from a federal regulatory perspective. So what I do is primarily on the regulatory side. As an attorney, I work with a lot of IOUs, I work with independent generators, mostly in terms of federal regulation. So I do a little bit of state regulatory work, but my focus today is really going to be on kind of what the high level developments have been from the federal regulatory standpoint. So we'll talk a little bit about wholesale market developments. Not going to get into the nitty gritty of the market rules themselves because they're voluminous, they're very complicated, and I do not know all of them. So I'm going to try and keep this kind of at a high level and then sort of talk about some new developments on the federal regulatory side that I think they're going to have some important implications for storage. They're not exclusive to storage, but they are going to have some impacts on storage. So kind of with that intro, I'll just go ahead and get started here. Why are we talking about federal regulatory issues when it comes to energy storage? One of the key things to keep in mind is the role of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is the federal regulator in the energy space, subset of DOE. I'll talk about why that's kind of important for energy storage and the way it interacts with wholesale markets. So FERC, from a high level, responsible for regulating wholesale sales of electricity and transmission of electricity interstate commerce. They have oversight of mandatory reliability standards. So that this is all under the Federal Power Act, a pretty wide kind of regulatory ambit here. Energy infrastructure, so ensuring that there's adequate transmission facilities. One thing FERC does not do, siting, very important. So they're really kind of an economic focused regulator. And then as well, there's the kind of security and reliability resiliency component under the Federal Power Act related to the reliability standards. 5-member commission. These are all presidential appointees confirmed by the Senate. We've got a chairman who is designated by the president. So it's a designation that comes from the president's office. And then to maintain the independence and the kind of nonpartisan nature of the commission, no more than 3 commissioners can be from the same political party. So you've got typically a 2 and 3 split on the commission, and you need at least 3 commissioners to maintain a quorum. So that's general structure of FERC, kind of in terms of background. Why is it important for storage? So specifically, we're talking about participation in wholesale markets, ISOs and RTOs regulated by FERC. FERC's got authority under the Federal Power Act to ensure that wholesale rates, terms, and conditions of jurisdictional service are just and reasonable. So that's the legal standard under the Federal Power Act. They cannot be unduly discriminatory or preferential. And so those words carry a lot of water. There's a lot packed into those words, but broadly speaking, that's the hook that FERC has for regulating how wholesale markets work. Okay, so that's kind of the regulatory piece of the actual market functions. Separately, FERC's got jurisdiction over public utilities. So these are the actual entities that it regulates. This is anything from a traditional IOU to a power marketer, regional transmission organizations, and ISOs as well. And so, as I mentioned, those market activities are conducted pursuant to FERC jurisdictional tariffs. Those are rate schedules, essentially, that are filed with FERC. They're formal tariffs. They need to be approved. They're subject to notice and comment and kind of stakeholder proceedings. And so, FERC tariffs that are published, which contain the market rules that energy storage resources and many other resources need to adhere to, are essentially the law. And so here, just a quick overview. I think everyone generally familiar with kind of this map, but an overview of where the FERC jurisdictional markets are. So in the continental United States, you've got Cal ISO, SPP, MISO, PJM, New York ISO, and ISO New England. And then, of course, down in Texas, ERCOT is not regulated by FERC. So the markets down there are separate and apart from FERC's jurisdiction. So we'll talk a little bit now about kind of the big landmark reforms that FERC has issued over the last several years. And I'll talk a little bit about the limits of those impacts as well, because I think one of the important things to keep in mind is that FERC definitely has a role to play here, but as I'm sure you all know, there's a large component of what happens in terms of energy storage development and really any kind of resource development, where the federal government is only playing, one portion of this entire puzzle. And so, this slide is titled "Landmark Reforms" because that's kind of how the orders I'm about to talk about were built. But I want to spend a little bit of time at the end after going through kind of the overview, talking about the efficacy of these rules. And so the very first one that I'll talk about in a minute is Order 841, which has sort of paved the way for energy storage participation in wholesale markets. But really quickly, the reason that FERC is dealing with these types of reforms is because it has, for a long time, recognized the value that storage resources can bring to the markets, to wholesale markets, but generally to consumers as well from an economic and reliability standpoint. Various FERC rulemakings before these landmark orders, which I'm going to talk about, touched on energy storage, but they sort of planted their flag with these two orders in particular that I'll get to. So what exactly is storage? I think you heard a little bit about it this morning. Generally, folks are familiar with it, but from FERC's perspective, it's any asset that's capable of receiving electricity from the grid, storing that energy for later injection of electricity back onto the grid. And in terms of its flexibility, it's often referred to in kind of the federal circles as the Swiss Army knife, because there's lots of solutions, various applications, quick response charging, discharging, ancillary services, and of course, energy arbitrage opportunities. Another thing to keep in mind is a lot of several markets that were on the screen previously have accounted for energy storage participation long before these FERC orders. And a good example is California ISO, which sort of paved the way in a lot of respects for some of the newer implementation of battery-focused rules. But ISO New England is another example. So up in the Northeast, storage has been around since the 70s. There are massive pump storage facilities, actually, close to 2 gigawatts about that have been playing in the ISO markets. I mention that because one of the interesting things about the way that FERC regulation and storage participation have collided is the fact that these markets have been traditionally designed for what you'd think of as traditional resources. So, your fossil plants, and more recently, peakers, gas peakers, newer technologies like flywheels, batteries, and the like, generally not a clean fit into the current market constructs. And pump storage is sort of its own dynamic. And so ISO New England's a great example of that because they've had these resources playing in the market since, the inception. But, the way that they are accounted for is totally different today than they were in the past. So just wanted to note that. So Order 841, as I mentioned, that's kind of the big one that you might hear about. It's titled Electric Storage Participation in Markets Operated by Regional Transmission Organizations and Independent System Operators. Long name, very lengthy order. I will not walk through everything that is in that order. I will say, though, that it was developed following a pretty lengthy stakeholder process. It attracted a lot of industry attention. The objective that FERC really had was to level the playing field. That's the way they looked at it. As I mentioned, RTOs and ISOs traditionally have been structured around resources that are older technologies, established technologies. What FERC really wanted to do is establish resource neutral rules for energy storage. So that could be batteries, flywheels, compressed air, and then of course pumped hydro, which is in concentrated pockets throughout the grid. It's also location agnostic. So the whole point of the order was to apply to resources, whether on the interstate transmission system, the distribution system, or behind the meter. And FERC implemented a minimum size requirement of 100 kilowatts. So pretty small by FERC standards in terms of what plays in the market. But the idea was to kind of balance the ability for a lot of disparate storage resources that could be on the distribution grid in the future with the difficulty from the ISO or the RTO's perspective in modeling these resources. So very broad reach. A lot of work had gone into developing the record before they got to this point in 2018. And the road since then, I would say, has been a slow one. It's been a little choppy. What often happens with these types of federal rulemakings is compliance filings. So ISOs and RTOs need to come back to FERC and basically say, here's how we're going to implement the directives you gave us. And for the better part of the last several years, FERC and the various regions have been going back and forth in terms of the details on how to do this. But just in terms of implementation, I'll mention ISO New England again. They started out kind of with your traditional pumped hydro resource. What they've moved to now in terms of a general participation model is kind of a two different asset classifications for storage. They're calling them binary storage facilities, which really apply to your traditional pumped hydro. The binary storage facilities are titled as such because they're recognized as one of two different assets. So they can be a generator where they're basically discharging onto the grid, or they can be a dispatchable asset where they're essentially charging, so they're consuming energy. They're called binary because they cannot do both at the same time, and that recognizes the limitations of an asset like the pump hydro facility, which cannot just flip a switch and go from one to the other. They're massive turbines. It takes a long time. On the other side of it, you've got a new asset type that recognizes what more kind of contemporary technologies can do, like batteries. That's called a continuous storage facility. And it's called that because it recognizes that batteries and other technologies can move continuously, nearly instantaneously. They can switch between charging and discharging across a wide range, depending on the limitations of the actual asset itself. And those assets can actually perform as three different classifications in the market, and they can do it simultaneously. So they can be a generator, and they can be the facility that consumes energy off the grid, just like the pumped hydro facilities. They can also participate in regulation resource service, so they can provide some ancillary services as well. And the way that ISO New England structured the rules, those assets, if you're registered as that type of facility, you can do all three at the same time. So I provide that as an example just to show you just one approach to how a region has incorporated different types of storage resources in response to FERC's order. In terms of legal challenges, one thing to note, when you have a FERC order that gets challenged, it goes up to the federal appeals court. And so in 2020, the DC Circuit actually issued an opinion on a very discrete aspect of Order 841, and that was the role of the states with respect to implementation. And so the question in that case was whether FERC exceeded its authority by not allowing state opt-out. So essentially the ability for states to prohibit storage resources on distribution systems from participating in wholesale markets. That was a very contentious issue. The reason I mention it is there's been a lot of push and pull as the grid has evolved between FERC's jurisdiction and the states. And so finding that dividing line has been a little bit tricky sometimes. And what the DC Circuit essentially said is, what you have here, even if it's a distribution-sided resource, is something that can impact in some way, shape, or form the rates, terms, and conditions of wholesale service, going back to that earlier slide I showed. So They basically said what FERC is trying to do here is fair game. And that was kind of a watershed moment from a legal standpoint because it really opened the door to what FERC could do in terms of how they're viewing their authority. It was a validation that the way that they'd interpreted their jurisdiction and the statute was okay by the courts. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Order 2222 because you can hear other panelists talk about it, but this is essentially the 841 model applied to DER aggregation. And so after FERC survived that legal challenge, they issued this order, which was really focused on aggregations of distributed energy resources. And so same model, RTOs and ISOs were required to submit participation models that needed to get approved by FERC, that had minimum minimum size requirements, other requirements that tariffs needed to address, like coordination with local distribution utilities and state regulatory authorities. And so this came out after 841, but also a major order developed after many, many years of contentious debate at FERC. And then timely in the sense that it was issued after FERC got the green light from the courts that its authority was kind of on all fours with the law. Mention that here because I heard at a conference recently someone refer to the Order 82222 as the year that it'll actually get implemented because it's taking a long time, and so 2222's got a long ramp up period just given the complexity of the work that's going under it. So I'm a little bit behind in terms of development compared to where everybody is on 841, but there's definitely been some movement there. So question is, did it actually work? I think this is kind of an unfair question to include in this presentation because I don't know if anybody really knows the answer to that. I think it's a little too early to tell. But one thing to keep in mind is that there's a significant amount of lead time that goes into developing these rules and implementing them. And we saw that with 841. FERC, at a minimum, gave everybody a year to file the changes in their tariffs and then another year from that date to implement. That was still not enough. And several of the markets actually came back and said, we need more time. And in one case, I think MISO requested delay until 2025 that FERC said, no, that's way too late. Now, keep in mind, this rule came out in 2018. So that's the kind of timeline we're talking about for full implementation. There are myriad reasons why this takes so long, but there are many good reasons for it. It's incredibly complex. It's sort of running in parallel to developments of these markets to overhaul, for example, software and modeling. And so making sure that all works together is really important to avoid having these markets unwind the results of market clearing. And so that's kind of the big challenge. But then another thing to keep in mind is I think an open question about how much of development for storage has actually been spurred by these orders. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that 841 and 2222 were sort of viewed as landmark, blowing the door off for storage participation. I don't know that the effect has been that dramatic. And I think that doesn't mean that storage participation and penetration has not increased, but that's likely driven by policies completely unrelated to FERC. So states especially have really aggressive policy goals in some jurisdictions that are going to play a much stronger role in terms of increasing storage participation. And so examples, New York has a 6 gigawatt goal by 2030. Illinois and Massachusetts have procurement goals as well. And other states are starting to require at least the consideration of energy storage in IRPs. I think Missouri might be one of those states. So on balance, has this actually increased storage participation? Unclear at this point. If you look at the interconnection queues for all these regions, there's just been a massive uptick in storage. What percentage of those resources actually make it onto the grid where steel is in the ground is totally an open question. But I think other policies are probably driving storage penetration more than what FERC is doing at this point. Really quick, because I'm running up on time here, I did want to mention one important emerging issue. This is not exactly a storage specific issue. It does have implications for storage developers. So under a law that's been on the books since the 1970s, Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act of 1978, or PURPA, certain types of resources are afforded all kinds of kind of regulatory relief if they meet certain classifications. If you are a renewable sourced facility under 80 megawatts in particular, you get a lot of regulatory benefits. FERC recently addressed an issue with a hybrid solar plus storage facility that had a nameplate capacity that exceeded that 80 megawatt threshold. That was a big deal because when you qualify under that 80 megawatt threshold, you can actually put to a local utility and require the local utility to capture all the output or purchase all the output from that QF, from the qualifying facility. The issue here was important because FERC kind of flip-flopped on its prior rationale of what actually counts. If you look at that 80 megawatt limit and what this facility was doing, in this particular case, it was about 150 megawatt solar array plus a 50 megawatt battery, well above that 80 megawatt limit. The developer said, well, look, I've got an inverter that's going to cap this at that statutory limit, so I should qualify for all these regulatory benefits. That eventually went up to the DC Circuit and it was upheld. So the implication here is really more for developers that are siting, I think, hybrid facilities or upgrading renewable facilities with storage resources. You can actually push that nameplate above the 80 megawatt limit, and the DC Circuit has said that's okay, which I think is pretty important, particularly for developers that are, looking to build hybrid facilities. A couple other emerging issues. I'm not going to take up too much time here, but they're in the materials. One thing to note, grid reliability concerns. As I mentioned, FERC does have jurisdiction over the reliability of the grid and is currently considering the impact that non-synchronous generators are raising on the grid. And so there have been a couple incidents that FERC is focused on. And so they actually directed NERC, which is the entity that develops reliability standards, to look into what they're calling inverter-based resources. And so this has the potential to actually impose additional burdens and obligations from a liability perspective on storage resources. So that is in the works, something to think about. And then, of course, supply chain issues and safety are also major things that developers are thinking about, as well as Public Utility Commission. So that is a really quick wrap up of kind of the emerging issues here. And I think I will turn it over unless there are any questions.
Are there any questions? Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. Quick question. The issue of state jurisdiction versus federal jurisdiction over battery energy storage systems, and you talked about three different aspects of it: behind the meter, behind the utility, and then I guess independent of both. Do you have a comment of what jurisdiction states would have on locating that facility there if it was tied completely to the grid?
Well, I think that's a good question. It's sort of going to depend on the state in terms of the actual siting, but I'll say just in terms of the jurisdictional hook, if you've got a facility that is, let's say, on the distribution system, so not behind the meter, on the distribution system, but not at that transmission level voltage, it's going to have the federal hook because it wants to participate in the wholesale market. So you've got that federal angle. The distribution angle comes in through the fact that you actually need to get the output of that facility over the distribution system, which is regulated by the state, all the way to the wholesale market. So that brings into play distribution charges, any kind of upgrades that are required from the distribution system to enable basically bidirectional charging, discharging, which sometimes distribution systems aren't built that way. And as well as any kind of co-location requirements from the local utility. So I think that's the piece of it that FERC had to keep in mind when they were drafting these rules. So there is definitely an interplay there. I'm not sure that anyone's completely figured it out, but as I mentioned, when it comes to the DER aggregations, that's why they included this requirement that ISOs and RTOs include the coordination piece. So when they're implementing these rules, particularly if you have an aggregation of electric vehicles, flywheels, and solar, all as one market resource, you got to talk to the local utility and you have to talk to the state regulatory authority to figure out how you're actually going to get that charge output onto the grid.
Next question, I guess, is just the determination of whether it's a transmission asset or a generation. Is it fish or fowl?
Yeah.
Is there any
Yeah, I mean, and
guidance on that?
That's a good question. I think some markets are trying to address that by saying if you're providing transmission asset type benefits, you're solely participating as a transmission asset. You don't have the ability to do both. But I think there are reforms that are in the works that are trying to address the ability to do both. So you can be storage as a transmission asset, but still definitely kind of state regulated generator.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Arjun, thank you so much.
you.
Appreciate it. All right, next up we have Jamie with Sonova. It is all yours, Jamie.
All right, thank you. Just check, make sure everyone can hear me.
You're good.
All right, great. Well, appreciate it. Really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this panel and talk about energy storage as a resource. My name is Jamie Charles, and I manage the grid services and microgrid policy for Sonova Energy. Sonova Energy is a leading national solar and energy storage service provider. We have customers across the U.S. and territories. And Sonova's goal is to be the source of clean, affordable, and reliable energy with a simple mission, powering energy independence. So next slide. As I said, while we're headquartered in Houston, Texas, we operate in over 40 states and territories, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and Saipan. We have over 250,000 customers, and we utilize a local network of dealers, sub-dealers, and new home installers that do all of our installations. Sonova then takes over after the installation and provides a 25-year service guarantee, as well as just offers just the overall maintenance and operation of the system. But where I get into play is where we can really capture that investment value that those customers have done. And this speaks directly to what I'm going to talk to you today about aggregated DERs and the use of energy storage, essentially residential home batteries, as a resource. Next slide. Well, I'm happy and proud to show the growth of Sonova. I really use this as an indicator of the market. So you can see that we introduced battery storage back in June of 2017, and the growth with Sonova has grown exponentially. And I think that's for a few reasons. One of those is just the opportunity and the offering tax incentive credits, but really also the realization that you can't really count on overall utilities to provide energy and on a reliable and resilient level. So a lot of customers and homeowners are going and out there and purchasing their own solar and storage systems, and that's going to allow them to, operate their homes during times of power outages. And you see this growing exponentially across the country, where there's severe storms, there's wildfires, there's floods, or freezes, such as in Texas or over in TVA this past December. So more and more customers are realizing that in order to get that full reliability service, they need to go out there and use that energy storage system to be able to have that access. Now, the issue is energy storage is expensive, and that's where we really try to work with these utilities, with the utility commissions, to grow these programs that offer pathways for customers to be able to utilize their assets and recoup some of that investment property, while also benefiting the ratepayers as well. And I'm going to speak to some use cases towards the end of these as I kind of walk through Sonova's offering as indicated to show what a virtual power plant and aggregated DERs are capable of doing. Next slide, please. So again, just quickly highlighting this, the customer acquisition, design, installation by dealers, and then Sonova takes over that monitoring and service that offers that long-term customer relationship. And this allows us to meet those evolving needs of our customers, again, pointing back to those different programs that we're able to sign them up then and participate them in. So really those programs are a key part of what we do and allow us to offer that, that resource back to our customers. Next slide, please. So this is depicting Sonova's adaptive home. And the reason why I want to show this is really how we utilize the smart meter devices, the solar, the storage, as a way to provide solar or provide energy storage as a resource. So within this depiction, we have the solar PV production, the energy storage and generation, as well as the smart devices within the home, such as a smart meter, EV chargers, home electric compliances, as well as the HVAC system. This creates a solution that integrates the use of all those assets, allows us to control and manage the technologies to make clean energy even more affordable and reliable and resilient. Next slide, please. So this is where I'm going to get into discussing, and Arjun spoke to it, and I appreciate that, is the ability of aggregated DERs to respond to grid needs, as well as participate into wholesale markets. So you take that Sunnova adaptive home, you take those microgrids, you take those other homes that have energy storage tied to them, and you're able to aggregate these into a very large load that's able to be offered up as what is known as a virtual power plant or a VPP. This strengthens grid resiliency by offering these aggregated DERs to support the local utility by utilizing those VPP solutions. So you can see how it flows back and forth there. Next slide, please. So focusing on the grid services, as I do, we showcase the ability for these capabilities to, or these resources to provide capabilities around active demand response curtailment, system-wide load shedding, distribution, transmission, or non-wireless alternatives, and as well as localized voltage support. So VPPs are aggregations of electrified grid connected devices, such as those devices I mentioned before, the AC, HVAC, grid interactive efficient buildings, solar plus battery storage systems, and plugged-in EVs. So when combined, these DERs are able to use, store, and or generate a significant amount of energy. So DERs can provide energy at a lower price than what the grid typically offers. So they do this cleanly. They offer customers greater resilience during those grid events. I was mentioning those weather-related, climate-related events, as well as just overall power outages. And they're able to do this by time shifting and shaving electricity demand through those DER management. So VPPs can reduce the utility's reliance on expensive and dirty peaker plants, which also results in a reduction on the strain of transmission and distribution infrastructure. So really those VPPs can decrease emissions and increase those utilization of those assets and capital efficiency. That results again into that reducing that energy cost burden on those consumers and improving reliability. I do like to point to a leading study that estimated by 2050, VPPs could avoid 44 to 59 million metric tons of CO2 emissions per year. And then by 2030, VPPs are capable of avoiding $17 billion of annual power sector expenditure. So that's a significant amount of emissions and rate savings that get spread across not only to the customers who have those batteries, but also to the overall general population and ratepayers, reducing the cost and creating a better air quality for the communities around them. But VPPs rely on DER deployment at scale. So it's really imperative to make these affordable, resilient, and clean energy accessible to all Americans. And some of these aspects that I'll touch on here in a little bit are the VPP software that's used by both the consumers and those VPP operators to reduce device electricity use during those peak grid stress, or in some case, export that extra energy back into the grid. So that's where that virtual power plant comes in, is that ability to export the significant load back into the grid when needed. Next slide, please. That software, again, this is just highlighting what sort of is what's enabling this to happen. Software that has the measurement and verification, the M&V, data analytics, asset level monitoring, and those forecasting capabilities really optimize our load control assets in our grid support programs. Next slide, please. So just a couple of key success keys successful to the programs. Because customer enrollment, we need, again, at scale. So we need these customers to be able to enroll long-term programs to increase the incentives for these customers that want to participate in, so they don't get overly burdened by continuously have to sign up for new programs. While I'm aware that, pilot programs are essential, right? They're essential to ease the fear and burden for utilities and regulators, allow for opportunities for the utilities to get up to speed, create whatever administrative aspect they need, new software they need to be able to do, operation and maintenance of these programs as well. But really, we strive for these long-term programs, and as well as partnering with top level OEMs. You'll see here, we have a list of the top OEMs that we work with. So these best-in-class product offerings allow for those customer choice, that seamless integration between OEMs, customers, and those utilities. So again, that customer enrollment allows that to increase. And this will allow the ability to scale and expand VPP solutions over time. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I really want to touch in the use cases, right? And so Arjun did a great job laying this groundwork for me to kind of come in here and talk about how these aggregated DERs are able to be used and are being used across the country in different markets. And I really like that the Swiss Army knife approach, because you'll see here that these VPP programs and these aggregated DER offerings really cover a broad ability for them to be able to offer these services back into the grid. So it's not just one single, let's export this energy back to the grid when it's needed, and that's it, right? There's a lot of different opportunities for these resources to be utilized. And as Arjun was speaking to for 2222, one of the areas that is already operating with these DERs being able to offer into the wholesale market is up in ISO New England, and within the forward capacity auction that Sunnova has participated in and won in the past couple of years. So just recently for FCA 17 that was just awarded, this is our third consecutive win in the ISO New England FCA. So we're securing an additional 38 megawatts. And I say that not only as a pride, but also to show how much energy is out there to be offered up into the market, that's going to be able to provide that back to those consumers. That's going to then, right, going to encourage them to go out there and participate more and more. So that's a significant amount of energy going back in from just one company. And I imagine if you're able to scale that at a much larger level, you'll see where the opportunities lay for these aggregated DERs. And so with this, Sunnova now holds the largest wholesale market capacity position by a behind-the-meter solar and battery storage developer in the New England region. Next slide, please. Again, another case study here. We look at connected solutions. Connected solutions, as I work across the country in these different markets, I see oftentimes being pointed to as sort of an example of what should be done. This is offered up in the national grid and Eversource territories up in New England. So the fleet of energy storage assets provide a day-ahead energy dispatch during periods of high demand and potential capacity needs across those national grid and Eversource territories. So the VPP operators, so they ensure the batteries have that maximum stated charge, so they're able to discharge when they need to ahead of that demand response window. And then they're able to maximize the discharge during those events, powering loads in the home, and then exporting that excess power. A lot of times you'll hear from people the fear that if they participate in these types of programs, that means that they lose that reliability and resilience that they get from that battery. Because batteries are expensive, as I said before, and unlike solar, they're not really doing it for a cost-saving structure. Yes, you can arbitrage your energy. You can be smart how you use it if you have time of use rates. But really, people are getting batteries for that resilience and reliability. So if you say to them, hey, you need to offer up this energy when the grid needs it most, they're going to be scared that that means that they're not going to have that ability and the resilience. So it's really important to be able to maximize those discharge events by optimizing that load at the home and ensuring they get the reliability as well as discharging that back to the grid. One area that my colleague has mentioned before, and I think it's a great example, is a spotlight or a stoplight. So if you look at a stoplight, you have the green, yellow, and red. Green light is the grid is performing great. There's no need for these resources to be able to participate. It's operating perfectly. Yellow flashes on. That means that there's some issue coming up. There's some maybe a potential overcapacity or capacity need issue. So that way they can then trigger these events, allow for these resources to participate and bring that back up to a green. Now, if it's a red, that means the power is out. And at that point, we're not going to be optimizing these. We're not going to be using these assets. That's when the customers need these assets the most, and they should be able to do that. You can look back into California this past year, or I'm sorry, in 2022 in September. So they had a potential brownout, and the state called upon all these resources individually to be able to, reduce load. Now, they were lucky that this was able to happen, and it did save the state from having that power outage. But these programs need to be there to allow so that we don't have to gamble on that risk. We don't need to gamble on a single entity, an individual knowing what to do, having the ability to do it, and doing it properly. So we need, and as well as compensation, they need to be compensated for that as well. So, next slide, please. So DRAM, which is the demand response auction mechanism located in California, it was created in 2014 under the guidance of the California Public Utility Commission, the CPUC. This is in an effort to harmonize the utility base reliability demand response within CAISO, and so the state's grid operator. The program seeks to allow CAISO to add these reliable demand response resources to areas of California where electric reliability may be at risk. So these are located in the 3 large IOU territories in California, the PG&E, SCE, and SCE territories. So we were able to reduce the customer base load demand on the grid by maximizing the discharging of our fleet of batteries during the typical afternoon demand peak. And again, those BPP operators integrated into our third-party aggregator to streamline the customer enrollment and dispatch notification, ensuring that optimal dispatches to maximize each individual home with that proper M&V on the incremental load. Next slide, please. Again, going back to New England within National Grid territory, again, Swiss Army knife, right? We've shown the ability to offer up these resources into the wholesale market. We've shown these resources being able to offer up into an auction mechanism in California that's used to reduce the load during peak demand times. But there's also here the voltage support, the ability for these resources to provide critical volt VAR optimization across the entire service territory or localize to areas of need. So this example of just the different capabilities of these resources to be used. Next slide, please. So demand response and LSA peak shaving. So the demand response program is administered by the auto grid systems for CPA, where the participants receive the financial incentives for participating in this program. Demand response programs are intended to encourage consumers, residential homeowners, and business owners to reduce the energy usage when the electricity consumption is anticipated to be much higher than the electricity grid can provide. So when the stress on the electricity is high, CPA will call a demand response event or called a DR event, in which participants in the power response program will be asked to reduce their electricity usage. So during the demand response programs, they're able to provide incentives to participants for reducing those energy usage during those events called by CPA. The reduced usage can reduce the stress on the electricity grid and then can lead to lower greenhouse gas emissions. In this case, the demand response events typically last a few hours between 1 p.m. and 9 p.m. on weekdays in the summer, but other times are possible. So I think one other area that I'd like to talk to as well as showing, right, that Swiss Army knife, Arjun, to steal that from you because it's great, is what I call the distribution investment deferral framework in California. So in 2021, DETA, we were able to win a contract in Stockton, California. This is a geographical opportunity targeted in timing. So on each side, there's 2 substations. Each side of those substation events take place between a 2-month period that have up to 40 calls for one side and 40 calls for the other side. So there's 2 different sides of the substations in Stockton. So our VPP capabilities were able to be leveraged through a targeted approach to relieve the grid stress in focus areas during specific event windows within the PG&E service territory. And we were happy and proud to work with PG&E on one of the first deployments of the behind-the-meter battery storage systems as a non-wireless alternative. This defers the need for PG&E to upgrade the distribution infrastructure of certain substations cost effectively, extending the useful life of that existing grid infrastructure while accommodating for customer energy demand. So PG&E's annual distribution resource plan identifies these areas that could benefit from distributed energy resource deployments that would avoid or defer traditional electrical distribution system upgrades and forecast the load growth within those service territories. So the DRP indicated that the targeted areas of the distribution system will require the increased capacity for only a handful of hours per year. And so Sunnova's distributed assets were perfectly positioned to efficiently meet that need while supporting clean energy and homeowner resiliency needs. DDIF was established in 2018, and CPUC has approved over 34 megawatts of battery storage contracts for the IOUs and 60 megawatts awarded in PG&E service territory. In the past few years, the residential market has deployed over 530 megawatts worth of battery storage systems, and half of those deployed systems were in the PG&E territory. So again, another opportunity to show how these energy storage devices are able to be utilized as a resource. And one thing to look at is key part of this is the role of aggregators, right? So we have the individual homeowners that have the battery storage in them, but then the aggregator is able to go in there and bring to the utilities a bulk power load. It reduces the burden on the utilities from doing the administrative aspects of them, the support for them, as well as the aggregators typically have that trust with the customers and building that positive customer experience. So average customers cannot fill out the paperwork and understand batteries and be able to call up the capacity. You know, they're able to provide advice. Aggregators are able to provide advice of what programs they need to participate in, like customer service, the program related questions, and how we can handle this for the customer. So that key piece within this is also the aggregators that need to be brought into the picture as well. And with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity to come up here and speak virtually.
Thank you, Jamie, very much. Let's give Jamie a welcome applause for giving us his time. Are there any questions? Yes.
I guess my question would be, it seems like a number of those examples were in states that are not vertically integrated utility regulation states with the more traditional cost of service regulation. So I guess my question would be, what is the business model for these types of programs in a state like Missouri, where it's much more of a vertically integrated cost of service model?
That's a good question. And I think that's where, as you pointed out, these, these areas that these programs have been able to operate in, they probably had an easier path forward, right? Because they didn't have to work with the integrated or the vertically integrated utilities. I think that's where some of the barriers come into play, is developing those programs. I can't speak directly to what a business model would look like in Missouri, but I would say that utilizing existing business models is an example of ways that you can interject that back into those utilities in there. And I think one of the ways that you could do that is allowing them to be able to provide that demand response resource, right? That's not necessarily injecting load back in, acting as a generator within those vertically integrated ones, but they are able to reduce and peak that peak load saving opportunity when that grid demand is at peak levels. So developing those demand response programs in there and allowing for aggregated DER to participate in them is a way that a state like Missouri would be able to utilize these programs.
Great. Any other questions? All right. Thank you so much, Jamie. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Next up, the last speaker on this topic is Miles from EPRI. Miles, thank you very much.
All right. Hello, everyone. There we go. As they said, my name is Miles Evans. I'm with the Electric Power Research Institute in our Energy Storage and Distributed Generation program. EPRI, as we call it, is a nonprofit research organization. We partner with electric utilities in the United States and around the world to conduct research on all aspects of the electric power system. And my program, the Energy Storage Program, focuses in on energy storage. We serve as a lot of different roles in a lot of different places, but primarily we serve the third-party, independent, unbiased, trusted source for information that a lot of people rely on. So with this talk about energy storage and how it's used as a resource in transmission, I'm going to go through a few different things here. One is a sort of high-level overview to begin with of how we view energy storage. But we're also going to get into some optimization-based capacity planning model results for energy storage across the United States, and how that contrasts with some specific examples we've worked on with utilities for doing transmission projects with energy storage that are specifically or explicitly there to offset the need for new transmission. I think Arjun talked a little bit about some reforms underway for multi-use applications and things like that. But we'll highlight some of the tension there and go for it. So back earlier on in 2015 in the energy storage progression, Harish Kamath, by the way, our director, put together this slide. So these are his words, and he said grid-ready storage back in 2015. And of course, all of the pilots that we worked on back then, I might emphasize the quotation marks around that phrase. And we'll touch a little bit more on the reliability and performance of contemporary energy storage systems as well in a moment. But we're moving through to the storage anywhere with real world conditions to storage everywhere, where storage is truly wherever you look being deployed. And then in 2030, we have the new landscape where we start to look beyond lithium-ion batteries as the dominant energy storage source, and maybe they will be beyond then too. But up until then, there's not really many other options for practical implementation. We might start to see new grid services emerge. I think synthetic inertia from inverter-based resources could be, something that we see a need for more than we do right now. And general renewables integration and how that changes. We already touched on voltage control and others as well. And for the record, by 2030, about 1 terawatt hour of energy storage globally is the projection. That's not that far away, and that's a huge quantity of energy storage. And to set the stage a little bit for why we're doing energy storage, the common perception is that it supports the low carbon grid of the future. We've heard that a bunch today, I think, and I think that is a correct perception. I think that's what's driving a lot of the policy around energy storage and a lot of the targets and other things like that is how energy storage can support the grid in a largely renewables or low carbon generation scenario. As I said, we'll contrast this a little bit with how energy storage can be used for transmission in the coming slides. Another comment on scale is that in the United States, by 2050, hundreds of gigawatts of energy storage is the projection today, and that's the National Renewable Energy Lab projection. But of course, how much of that is going to be long duration energy storage, or what duration distribution can we expect for these new energy storage systems? And really, we don't know the answer to a lot of those right now, but we're working on it. Also, that the variety of energy storage types that we're seeing right now, even within the category of lithium-ion batteries, is only a good thing. It makes implementation harder, but the variety can support a more robust system. So let's take a look at some capacity planning model results that we ran at EPRI. This is our regen model, which is an economy-wide capacity planning model. We just ran this case, pretty simple case here, as a snapshot in the year 2035 and gave our model different levels of constraint regarding emissions. So on the left, in the left plot here on the very left, we have a reference scenario, which could consider the business as usual with an enormous quantity of gas generation in the United States. As we move to the right, we're getting more and more stringent on the emissions restrictions. So we go from reference to a net zero scenario. where we allow for fossil generation as long as it's balanced by biofuels and carbon capture and storage. A carbon-free scenario where there are no emissions at all from generation, but we still allow things like nuclear, and then a renewable scenario which removes even the option for nuclear or other non-emitting generation that's not renewable. The black bars along the top are the storage as a fraction of total generating capacity. And with these scenarios, these are the least cost results here. It's an optimization model who tries to minimize total cost. But it does not show things like transmission build out, which is of course, can be a competitor with energy storage when integrating large quantities of renewables. We do, however, see though that as we make the emissions restrictions more and more stringent, we get, sort of exponential curve there with more and more energy storage. The other thing to consider is how much duration are we asking of our energy storage systems? These days, of course, 4 hours or less is common with lithium-ion batteries pretty much exclusively. But if we're trying to get to one of these really strict carbon-free or renewable scenarios, then all of a sudden, the power component, the power capacity of an energy storage system becomes the non-binding constraint on how it can be used, and the energy capacity or the duration becomes the important thing. And indeed, in these cases, we see very long duration storage appearing in the model. I have on the right there for this duration plot 4 different technologies, and in each of those technologies, we have the 4 different scenarios down below. And generally, though we had to block out exactly what technologies they are, you can consider the technologies on the right to be the lowest efficiency and lowest cost technologies, and those on the left to be highest efficiency, highest cost, quite generally. So yeah, in the very strict scenarios, we see tons and tons of very low cost, long duration, low efficiency storage. But a comment on the dominance of lithium-ion batteries. I think others have also touched on this as well. Pumped storage dropped below 90% of the energy storage in power terms. I think, power terms in the United States for the first time. And almost all of the other energy storage is electrochemical, first of all, but especially lithium-ion batteries right now. Lithium-ion batteries have been in development for decades and have been spurred along by consumer electronics and now electric vehicles more and more. And so have enjoyed a huge head start over other grid scale energy storage technologies. Even so, lithium-ion batteries still suffer from some reliability concerns that other resources that are on the grid today don't suffer as badly. So a good rule of thumb that we've seen is, an energy storage system might spend several times more time in unplanned maintenance or unavailable than traditional resources in the grid. We don't have the end of this, what should be bathtub chart showing, the rate of failure versus age of equipment. Part of that's because of data availability and the nascency of energy storage. Part of it's also because energy storage is often retired before it actually fails and instead degrades or goes offline for another reason. So with all of these things in mind, and a good understanding of why we're doing energy storage in the first place and how lithium-ion fits into that, let's look at then the contrast, which would be a transmission energy storage project. We have done several planning studies with transmission energy storage at EPRI. Some of them are scheduled anyway to be built, but the chart on the left here is admittedly from a distribution system, but the approach here would be to look at particular locations where there might be overloaded assets or other voltage, et cetera, problems. And then to understand in a time series basis, hour by hour, how can energy storage be used to, first of all, not cause a problem with that overloaded asset or other voltage issue, et cetera. And second of all, actually offset the need for an upgrade that would be triggered by the overload or other problem. So that gets to the chart on the right, which is admittedly a cartoon, but this is the approach that we use with real data as well. We can understand what we call the operational envelope for energy storage with this data. So here we have a chart where there's discharging up, charging down, zeros in the middle, and the x-axis is time. The gray areas in the top and the bottom represent the region that the storage system is not allowed to be in. If we go outside of those regions, it will cause one problem or another. A voltage out of bounds or an overload issue. And as long as we stay within this operational envelope, that's going to solve our transmission or distribution need. And we can, charge and discharge as we wish within that envelope, as long as our state of charge, of course, remains within bounds, and everything's happy. The blue areas here, where the charging limit goes above zero, are where discharge is required, actually, to make sure that the overload is avoided. So we generate an operational envelope like this for each one of the projects that we do in some capacity or another. In some projects, the operational envelope is just a few hours a year. Just a few hours of peak loading that would trigger an enormously expensive transmission upgrade, something like that. And indeed, there are cases where, well, actually, with distribution system needs anyway, whole microgrids have been built at the end of long distribution feeders because of the enormous expense associated with upgrading the distribution feeder. And even then, the microgrid is only actually required to island and provide power. It's kind of a different scenario for a few hours every year. So that leaves, another 8,000 plus hours in the year with which we can do other things with the energy storage system if we're allowed. So in the particular case that I was thinking of with this cartoon, they could actually, or are planning on in the future, using their energy storage system for energy arbitrage and some ancillary services as well, and kept within that operational envelope. So the point here is that there is, with transmission energy storage projects, a misalignment often between how the storage system needs to be operated for the transmission need and how it was envisioned to be operated by the societal level capacity planning. That transmission project had no knowledge of when peak net load occurs, and the energy storage project, unless it's given explicit direction to, may do nothing to support the decarbonization objectives of the deployment in the first place. It might still count for targets and other things, even though its operation has not been aligned. Parallels can be drawn with any distribution upgrade deferral project, resilience projects, customer storage for demand charge management or energy time shifting on an electricity bill. All of those things aren't necessarily aligned, and so don't tend to show up or aren't really considered in the capacity planning model results like I showed in the past. Or in a utilities IRP, for example, often things like that. So yeah, we at EPRI are trying to solve issues like this through research. We have an energy storage research roadmap here. And in the supplementary slides beyond the end of my presentation here, I left a large number of resources that are free that we develop at EPRI and publicly available. So if you're interested, please take a look. especially things like the Energy Storage Integration Council that we run, an open forum for energy storage, also free to participate. Please take a look. It's a great place to learn more and engage with other people and utilities in the space who are struggling with energy storage implementation at the moment. Thank you, everyone. Any questions?
Thank you, Miles. I don't think we have any questions online. Any here? I appreciate you coming in all the way from DC. We're at the end of the day, so there is a little, food there to pick me up. We have one other session with SPP and MISO, but if no other questions or no other thoughts. All right, we'll go ahead and take a 15-minute break. Please join me in thanking the panelists for coming in today.
I didn't understand all that.
A little technical. I don't know what is going on here. We've got so many other slides.
I'm gonna check out.
Okay.
Good program.
Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
See you.
I'll get you the paper and we can talk about Kehoe.
I think Keo could be an asset to it.
Yeah, I mean, he's John Deal. Here, so I think Kehoe has some connections with so that economic development is. So, thank you.